Hi there. Welcome. Hello. Julia. Hello. Hi. Okay, so Julia, I can't seem to invite you. Julia, could you request to be on the live because I can't seem to be able to send you an invitation. Hello. Yeah. Hi. Hey. How are you? Is my voice clear?
Your voice is clear. Is
All
mine?
right. It's perfect. It's perfect. You look perfect. You sound perfect. Everything is perfect.
Thank
So,
you.
good morning to you, Julia,
Thank
and thank you very much.
you.
I hope you slept well.
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Good, good. I haven't been sleeping well. I keep having this nightmare of a talking lizard. I swear to God.
And is the lizard saying scary things? Is that
No,
why
it's a
it's
little lizard, and I'm trying to kill the lizard. And last night I finally managed to kill it, and right before it died, he told me, "Don't use so much poison. It's not good for yourself." And I was like, "Well, okay."
it's a very interesting message.
Do you think that has a meaning?
Probably. Probably.
Probably. Probably.
Probably.
Yeah. Wake up call.
Yeah. Probably. I mean, yeah. There's plenty of dream dictionaries you can look at. Probably there's
Yeah,
some kind of
definitely.
talk to someone who's studying psychology. They'll be able to help you with the meanings too, I'm sure.
I should. I should. All right. So, I'm so excited about today's session, Julia.
I too.
Yes, I'm
Excited.
just gonna go ahead and do a recap. It's a
Got it.
word I've learned recently, recap.
Recap
It's
is a good
so
word.
useful.
It is
Yeah,
very
I didn't know it until a month ago. And I don't know how. I didn't. But anyway, I'm gonna do a recap. So last session we
mm-hmm.
we went on and we talked about the generalities of 5 different types of writing.
Mm-hmm.
Storytelling, academic writing, and scientific writing, news, opinion pieces, and blogging, and technical writing and business writing. And the last one was ad writing, copywriting, and marketing. And
Yes.
then we decided to talk about them in detail in each session.
Mm-hmm.
But you did mention that one thing they all have in common is that all writing, no matter the type, they're trying to tell a story. And the
Yes.
story has a beginning, it has a mid part, and it has an ending. And all
Yes.
of them have to serve the point of the story. They have to make a point. So today, I believe we're going to be talking about the first topic, story writing and creative writing. So the stage is yours, Julia. You're at the helm. Guide us through the storms.
Okay. So, first we should talk about exactly what kind of writing I'm discussing here, right? So, when we talk about story writing and creative writing, I'm typically talking about fiction, right? So that includes anything that's completely made up.
Mm-hmm.
That's short stories, that's novels, It can also include some types of nonfiction, right? It can include memoirs. And a memoir is usually a type of autobiography where someone writes about a specific time in their life or a specific theme that they've had to go through for their whole life. It also talks about autobiographies, which is when a person writes their story, usually from beginning to end. So there are a couple of authors or people that have written autobiographies, but because their life was so long, it's in chapters. So there's 5 or 6 books that go through their whole autobiography. So there are those. So it's typically any kind of book or story that actually does have, you know, kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end, and where you get to know specific characters involved in whatever's happening, right?
Yeah.
It can include poetry, but I'm pretty much, unless there are questions and stuff about poetry, we could talk about that. But poetry is its own animal. It's things with poetry are very different. There is one type of poetry that everything that we talk about here will cover. And there's a type of poetry called narrative poetry that essentially is a poem that tells a story. And there are some very, there's plenty of Google searches that you can do. I think there's some of the most well-known ones are done by John Milton, was in the 1700s. He was generally right around the time of Shakespeare. He wrote very long narrative poems. The Odyssey and the Iliad, right? This goes to the Greeks. Those are all narrative poems. They're epic poems. They go on for a long time, but they're all poems, right?
And I should mention that, and that Iran also has its, for our Iranian viewers, Iran also in that time, was very, and is still famous for its epic book, the Book of Kings, as it translated in English. But I guess a more accurate translation would be the Master Book, written by Ferdowsi, and it's an epic, goes thousands of pages, and just like the examples you mentioned, it would be a great work of narrative poetry.
Narrative poetry, yeah. And this isn't, narrative poetry these days isn't done very often. Not that I've seen. Most of the poems, just because of the evolution of writing, at least in America, I don't know about in other parts of the country, but at least in America, everything seems to be getting shorter, right? Between Twitter and Facebook and creating social media posts, everything is getting shorter. So long narrative poems don't seem to be happening. They don't seem to be popular right now. I'm sure they're happening, but they're not super, it's not one of those things where it's like, oh, this person, this popular author is writing narrative poetry. But poetry is its own
animal.
Yes. Which, again, if you have questions about poetry, we can talk about poetry. But today we're talking about story. But whenever, one of the things when you are learning to write in America, and I don't know how other teachers teach things, but when you were learning to write in America, the general consensus seems to be that you must outline everything that you're writing. You need to make sure, most of the time that is, what is your first paragraph going to say? What is your second paragraph going to say? What is your third paragraph going to say? When you're writing a story, your outline looks very different. You actually have to start with plot, with conflict, and with characters. So you have to understand those and know what those look like in your head, or on paper if you'd rather, before you can really get started. So pretty much all of these are developed at the same time. And that is important to know, because I think what a lot of people do, particularly if you're in any kind of like class, like creative writing class, or you're learning to write and the teacher just says, oh, just write this, you know, like I had high school teachers that said, oh, write a science fiction story. And she thought that it was that was a fun activity, but my brain doesn't think in science fiction because I can't create, like, it's really hard for me to create different worlds. So this was the hardest assignment she ever could have given me. And it wasn't fun because for me, I have to spend months or years thinking about the plot and thinking about the story and thinking about the characters before I can even begin to write, and to actually get something down on paper. So oftentimes, depending on the author, the way that you are outlining is just happening in your head even before you start writing anything down. But we'll first start with plot. So plot, what's known as plot, is your basic storyline. It's what happens in the book, right?
Yeah.
And that plot always leads to what's known as a climax, which is the point where everything changes. So everything in a story will lead to all of the activities and all of the things in the story will lead to this one point. It's usually the most exciting point of the book where you can't put anything down. It's the one point where it's kind of everything comes to a head. Yeah. Right? When all the arguments start, it's when the battle is going on. It's when, you know, everything's happening. And
you realize the villain was not the villain.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. All of those things. Right. So after that point, all of the main characters change as a result of that. And then after that, that usually happens, you know, 3/4 of the way, 3/4, 5/6, almost all the way through the end of the story. After that, there's a very short period of time. In a book, it can be like a few chapters. In a movie, it's like the last 15 minutes. It's essentially where it shows you how the characters have changed as a result of the crime. So then you have, so stories have plot. You must have a plot. Without a plot, you have nothing, right? Yeah. So then you have conflict. Now, conflict is essentially the problems or issues that arise as a result of the plot. So, and these conflicts are going to be different depending on who the characters are. So there are, when you take a literature class, they've defined them, like all of the kind of literature powers that be have defined these types of conflicts. They are person versus person, person versus nature, person versus themselves, person versus society, person versus technology, person versus the supernatural, which mostly will happen in fantasy books, maybe, and person versus their destiny. So those are the main types. And there are subtypes, right? With person versus nature, it can be, a person fighting with a bear, right? Person versus animal is a type of person versus nature, right? Yeah. So there are ones with them. But what you have to know about conflict is that conflict only occurs if the character thinks it's a problem. If the character doesn't think it's a problem, then it doesn't matter. It's not a conflict, right? So if you have, let's say that you have a person that lives that has decided to live out in the wilderness. They don't have electricity. They don't have running water. They live way out in the boonies. They, you know, they hunt for their game. They grow their own food. They live, you know, they live miles and miles from society. And they've learned how to do it, and they're fine with it. And their everyday life is just fine. There's nothing big. There's no major blizzard or flood or anything like that, right? This is just their life. It's not going to be a conflict. But you put someone that lives in the middle of a city and you throw them out there, then just trying to get meat, trying to snare rabbits or squirrels or whatever they're going to use, that's all going to become a conflict for the person from the city, right? Yeah. So conflict occurs based on who your characters are and how they deal with the storyline. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. So I have a question in the back of my head, and I don't know when to ask it. And I've always had this question. You know, sometimes the plot is really simple. So it's like a straight line. And the story happens in a straight line. But then